Hey guys, it's Sebastian from AskSebby, and today we are going to talk about 4 strategies, so a quadrant of options, if you are someone who has low credit card spend who wants to play the game. Before we dive into it though, a big favor is to give this a thumbs up, and if you're someone who likes content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. So we'll talk about 4 different options or play styles that you would want to consider, but before we do that, we're going to talk about 2 exceptions. The first one is going to be for people who have low spend but who have high assets. The reason this matters is because there are going to be some setups where if you have more money, then it's just easier to run it. An easy example of this is going to be the Bank of America setup, where when you have more than $100,000 in assets with them, this can be investments, it can be your stocks in Merrill Lynch, then you're going to get substantially higher multipliers. Again, like I just mentioned, it does not need to be liquid, so you can still make your money work for you. And if you are someone who has retirement accounts, you can move them over from your other brokerage into this one to Merrill Lynch in order to get that bonus. Side note, they typically also run promotions, so if you are moving in quite a bit of assets, then you might as well get that few $100s as well as that bonus. I have talked about this setup in the past before, so I would recommend watching that specific video, but this one does work out pretty well if you're someone who's lean fire or who's fire, just because you're saving up money, you have that money anyways, and you're not looking to spend too much. Technically, there's also another option with this if you have your money with Schwab, just because you can get $100 or $200 off the Schwab Platinum card, but I feel like if you have low spend, it's really hard to justify that Schwab Platinum card given how the card works and given how the benefits work. Plus the tiny detail that you need $1 million for $200 off and $250,000 for $100 off. The American Express Platinum card really tends to work for people who have higher spends. So that's exception number 1. Exception number 2 is if you have a big life change coming and this is temporary. The easiest example is if you're someone who's currently in school and you don't really make that much, so you don't spend that much, but in 6 months' time when you have that full-time job, you're going from making $10,000 to let's say $80,000. In those situations, I'd recommend just keeping the setup that you currently have and waiting until that happens, just because you might be leaving a lot of money on the table by adding cards that don't really help you for when you have that higher income. A lot of issuers such as Chase, Barclays, as well as Citi have a lot of restrictions where if you have too many cards in too short of a period, you're not going to be eligible for certain good cards that they have. Chase has 524, Barclays has 624, and Citi has a 6-6 rule. Even if you look at other banks like US Bank, they don't like to see too many new accounts in too short of a span. The main takeaway is that you want to make decisions that future version of you, so future Sebby, is going to be happy with. One more exception before we dive into the 4 setups is if you are someone who has spend that you haven't considered. So if you're a student, diving back into that example, you might have tuition payments that you can make, and oftentimes it might be at a 0% fee. So you're paying a ton of tuition anyways, and that sucks, but why not hit minimum spends, hit these intro bonuses with that spends? If you're someone who has a mortgage, then you can actually pay that off using something like Plastic. There is a 2.5% fee, but it works for MasterCards and it's a pretty good way to hit bonuses. On that note, if you want to try Plastic, we have a link down below to learn more about it. And if you're someone who hasn't liked the video yet, give it a thumbs up. The easiest way to think about the 4 options is going to be as a quadrant. So you have the number of cards you're willing to get as well as the willingness you are to work for those cards. So some cards require more work than other cards, and depending on your willingness, that's going to change the setup that you're going to want to run. If you're someone who doesn't want to get as many cards and you also don't want to put too much work into it, then my recommendation would be just getting a 2% card like the Citi Double Cash card, Fidelity 2%, or the PayPal MasterCard, just to lock in that value and then set it and forget it. The big benefit here is that you can focus on what really matters, which is probably going to be making more money, and you don't really have to stress out too much about this, and you probably don't want to deal with this anyways. The disadvantage is that if you are willing to get more cards, then there's a lot more money on the table, especially if you are someone who is at that low income range where $200 makes a difference. If I was deciding between these cards, I'd probably go with the Citi Double Cash card just because you have a bit more optionality, which is important because we really don't know what the future holds. Fidelity card sounds pretty nice and I'm not as familiar with their system, but it could end up like the Uber card, and if they do some dramatic change, then you're going to be stranded with a card that doesn't really add much value. With the Citi card, if you don't like the double cash, if they decide to nerf it, then you can always product change to one of their other ones, such as the American Airlines card or one of their other partnerships where there's value there. The other thing too is if you end up running a city setup in the future, if your income, spending habits change, then city points are actually worth more than 2%, even though it's called a double cash, just because you can actually redeem those towards travel if you end up running that setup. PayPal one's fine. I think getting approved for it is a lot easier than these other options, but at the same time, I've also heard a lot of horror stories about people getting shut down. Typically people who are digital nomads who end up working abroad, who tend to have large money transactions, getting their PayPal account shut down, which subsequently gets their credit card shut down. Might be a non-issue though, given the topic of this video, but that's always something that I'm scared about. Number two is if you're someone who doesn't want to get too many cards, but you are willing to put in a little bit of work. So here you actually have two different paths. The first path is going to be the 5% path, and the other path is picking a few cards. With the 5% path, you have the Chase Freedom, you have the City Dividend, if you have it, otherwise you can't get it right now, the Discover It card, as well as the US Bank Cash Plus card. The idea here is that you might as well maximize that 5%, and I feel like that's the range where you actually move the needle. For three of those cards, the Chase, the Discover, as well as the City, it is going to be a rotating category, so you do need to check every 3 months, which I don't think is too much work. For most people, you probably check sports anyway, so this is just one additional step, one additional thing you're checking. With the US Bank one, you do get to pick the categories, which ends up being pretty useful just because you can focus on the ones that actually make sense for you. If I were in a position to pick a card though, I'd probably go with the Freedom and the Discover It card just because Freedom points are worth a bit more than just the 5%, and Discover It, you're going to earn effectively 10% in the first year. For the Discover one, it's because they have a cashback match program, which makes it pretty useful. And then for the Freedom one, if you look at the terms, even though they say you're earning cashback, it's really going to be UR points, which are ultimate reward points, which have a bit more value, especially if you do decide to run a Chase Trifecta in the future, or if you end up getting a Chase Sapphire Preferred or any other card where you can transfer those points out to a different program, such as Hyatt, where you can typically get about 2 cents per points. If all of that sounds very confusing and you want to keep it very simple, especially if you don't want to have to check what are the categories and which cards to use every 3 months or so, I'd recommend looking into the pick a card strategy, which would likely be picking the Wells Fargo Propel or some other card where you focus on the multipliers that make sense for you. With the Wells Fargo Propel, you're earning 3x points back on dining, gas stations, ride shares, transit, flights, hotels, homestays, car rentals, and streaming. Pretty easy pick a card option if you are someone who wants a bit more work, but you don't want to get too many cards. Since we are at the middle stage of this chart, if you are someone that wants to learn about any of these cards that we just talked about, and you want to support our channel, we do have links that are on our website, AskSebby.com, as well as down below in the description box. The big problem with those two options is that if you have very low spend, then it doesn't move the needle enough and it doesn't really help you. And for those people, I would still focus on making more money rather than getting more percentage back for the money that you're spending. If you are willing to get cards though, then I think it actually changes the equation quite a bit because there's going to be a lot of cards out there that offer $150 or $200 for spending $500 or $1,000. Most of the time it's going to be within a 3-month period, so if you spend $500 within 3 months, you're going to get $150 to $200 back. If you take this as a percentage, you're looking at 30 to 40% back, which is pretty substantial. I think if I was in that situation, this is the path that I would take, just because there's a lot of value on the table and it's really easy to get that value. The main disadvantage is that you do end up getting more cards, so you do have to manage it, and it is arguably a bit more work, but there is a harder path that we'll talk about in a second. Generally speaking, if you do keep your cards in good standing, it's not going to hurt your credit score in the long term. So I know that's a pretty big fear for people. And typically it's just paying off your cards in time, keeping that utilization extremely low, and then making sure that you have that strong base of cards. You'd probably keep most of these cards, and the fact that they don't have an annual fee, just use it once every 6 to 12 months and you're in a pretty good spot. Good examples of cards here are going to be the Discover It card, Chase Freedom card, Chase Freedom Unlimited, Bank of America Cash Rewards, Capital One Saver One card. There's a lot of choices here, especially from smaller issuers. In terms of how I would prioritize this, I would start off with Chase just because they have the 524 rule, and then I would go to Capital One because they tend to be harder to get once you have a very strong base of cards, and then American Express would be at the bottom of the list just because it does potentially screw you out of some pathing in the future if you change your minds. We've also seen some people get locked out of American Express bonuses for not spending enough money on their cards, so if you are a low spender, this might screw you over in the long term. If you're someone who has low spend, especially if you have low income, then $200 probably makes a huge difference. The final group is going to be if you are willing to get a lot of cards and you're also willing to do some work. For the most part, this is just going to be an expansion of the group that we just talked about, but we are going to add in some travel cards. I'll put some up on the screen, but you do have a bunch of different choices, whether it's from United, from Delta, or from American Airlines. In terms of priority, I would base it off of the cards that you would want and also the rules that are in play. If you are doing this playstyle, then you probably want to make sure that you're not leaving money on the table. If we pull in the cashback side as well, we'll notice that you are actually going to run into a bunch of different roadblocks when you pick your cards. So assuming that you start off with a Discover It card, because that's a pretty normal card to start off with, then you're going to have 4 slots left for Chase, and you only have 5 cards here to pick from that have relatively low minimum spends. After that, you can probably pick 1 or 2 Barclays cards before moving down the list. Looking at this list, this is one of the reasons why I would say don't rush towards American Express, just because there are going to be other cards to get, and rushing there means you're leaving money on the table. You're not necessarily looking to use these points to go to crazy places, but if you are someone who wants to go back home for Thanksgiving, then this ends up being very helpful. To me, it's also good to have some points banked in case something happens back at home. It's just nice to have those points, especially for last-minute flights that are probably going to destroy your bank accounts. It might not get you there for free, but at least it lightens the blow a bit. On that note, if you do want to learn more about these cards, pretty much all of the random cards that we listed in this video, and you want to support our channel, a very easy way to do that would be to use the links that are on our website, AskSebby.com, as well as down below in the description box. Make sure the offers are competitive, but very easy way to support the channel. My question for you guys is, if you are someone who is running one of these setups, what are the pros and what are the cons? Let me and the community know down below. And are there any other setups that I'm forgetting about that would also be useful? If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. It really helps us out. If you know anyone else who would benefit from what we just talked about, share this with them. It'd probably help them out. But otherwise, hope you guys liked it. See you guys next time.